For more than 70 years, they were the most photographed couple on Earth. A queen and the man who walked always 3 steps behind her. And yet, for the final stretch of that extraordinary marriage, Prince Philip did not live under the same roof as Queen Elizabeth II. He chose instead a modest 5-bedroom farmhouse, set in a quiet corner of the Sandringham estate, miles from the palaces where his wife continued her reign. The tabloids, of course, knew exactly what to make of it. An elderly couple living apart, a marriage worn thin by decades of duty, a husband who had finally had enough. The headlines practically wrote themselves. But the people who actually knew Philip, the people who had grown up beside him, watched him work, understood what made him tick, saw something the headlines never could. And none of them understood him better than his only daughter. Of all 4 of the Queen's children, it was Princess Anne who shared his temperament most completely. The same restlessness, the same impatience with fuss, the same fierce need to be useful and to be left alone to get on with it. When Anne spoke about her father after his death, she didn't describe a man drifting away from his wife. She described a man who had spent his entire life finding ways to make himself count, and who, at the very end of it, had finally earned the right to do things his own way. To understand why Philip spent his last years away from the Queen, you have to understand the man Anne knew. And once you do, the whole arrangement stops looking like a mystery and starts looking like the most natural thing in the world. This is that story. Let's begin with something that surprises a lot of people because it sets the tone for everything that followed. Long before Philip ever moved to the countryside, he and Elizabeth did not actually share a bedroom. And this wasn't a late-life development or a sign of a cooling marriage. It was there from the very beginning. The detail comes from someone with no reason to invent it. Lady Pamela Hicks, Philip's own cousin and the late Queen's lady-in-waiting, who spent decades inside that world. In her writing about the couple, she explained that separate bedrooms were simply the norm among the British upper classes. Her reasoning was disarmingly practical. You don't want to be disturbed by snoring, she said, or by someone flinging an arm or a leg across the bed in the night. And when you do feel like sharing a room, you can, but the point is that it's a choice. There's a kind of luxury, she suggested, in being able to choose. That word choice sits at the center of this entire story. When Elizabeth and Philip set up home together at Clarence House in 1949, they had adjoining bedrooms connected by a door. Not separate lives, connected rooms. They could come together when they wanted to and retreat to their own space when they needed it. And that pattern held for the rest of their marriage, across every residence they ever shared: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham. To modern ears, raised on the idea that closeness means sleeping in the same bed every single night, it can sound cold. But to anyone who understands the world they came from, it was nothing of the kind. It was a marriage built, from the first night, on mutual respect for each other's space. And it lasted 73 years, longer than the marriages of most couples who never spend a night apart. So the seeds of the arrangement that the tabloids would later sensationalize were there from 1947. The only thing that changed in Philip's final years was the scale of it, and that change had a very specific cause: retirement. In August 2017, at the age of 96, Prince Philip officially stepped back from public life. Take a moment to absorb what he was retiring from. Since his wife became queen in 1952, he had carried out tens of thousands of engagements, more than 22,000 solo appearances alone, on top of everything he did at her side. He had been the longest-serving consort in British history. He had spent the better part of 7 decades supporting a reign that was never his, walking that careful step behind, bowing to a protocol that placed him forever in the supporting role, swallowing his own naval ambitions to do it. By any reasonable measure, the man had earned a rest. But here is the question that the cottage answers. When a prince retires, where does he go? Not to Buckingham Palace, with its 775 rooms and its constant churn of staff and ceremony. Not even to the grandeur of Windsor. Philip chose, of all the places available to a man of his rank, a plain farmhouse called Wood Farm, a 5-bedroom cottage tucked into a secluded part of the Sandringham estate, looking out toward the sea. And this is where his daughter's understanding of him becomes the key that unlocks everything. Princess Anne has always been the most independent of the Queen's children, the one who built a life of her own, an Olympic-level equestrian, a working royal so relentless she has topped the family's engagement tables year after year, a woman famous for having no patience whatsoever for unnecessary fuss. When she was once asked, years ago, whether she might ever slow down, she shot back that she only had to look at the older members of her family to know the answer was unlikely. That dry, unsentimental refusal to ease off, that came from somewhere. It came from him. After Philip died, when Anne spoke about her father, she kept returning to the same idea, that he was a man defined by usefulness and curiosity, not by status. She remembered that he had asked more questions than he gave opinions, that he was always, genuinely, more interested in learning than in being listened to. She marveled at how few people truly grasped the sheer breadth of his interests, and how generously he had supported an astonishing range of causes, often far from any spotlight. In a documentary recorded about his life, she described his restless instinct to improve things, the way he was forever wondering how on earth you could actually make a difference. When he first took on the impossible, undefined role of consort, she pointed out, nobody had even thought about what he was supposed to do. So he found the ways himself. He carved out an impact that nobody handed to him. Now hold that portrait up against Wood Farm, and watch how perfectly it fits. A man like that, curious, restless, allergic to fuss, happiest when he was busy and self-directed, was never going to find peace rattling around a palace as a retired ornament. The cottage gave him exactly the things his character demanded. He oversaw the installation of a new kitchen. He hung his own watercolors on the walls. He redesigned the rooms to suit himself. He read, he painted. He reportedly even ran a small truffle operation on the grounds. And he entertained friends in a relaxed, informal way that the rigid protocol of official residences had never once allowed in 70 years. The staff at the cottage didn't even wear uniforms. For the first time in his adult life, Philip was not a supporting character in someone else's story. He was simply a man in his own home, doing things his own way. For someone of his temperament, the temperament his daughter knew better than anyone, that wasn't exile. It was liberation. And here is the detail that demolishes the marriage in trouble narrative entirely. The Queen came to him, often. Elizabeth, of course, could not retire. She was the monarch, and the machinery of the crown demanded her presence. The weekly audiences with the Prime Minister, the investitures, the receptions, the endless paperwork of a working sovereign. London and Windsor needed her. There was simply no reason for Philip, who had no official duties left, to chain himself to that exhausting rhythm just to keep up appearances. So the logistics sorted themselves into something sensible. She worked from the palaces. He rested at the cottage. And in between, she visited far more frequently than the press ever bothered to report. Those visits to Wood Farm produced the single most revealing image in this whole story. According to the royal biographer Robert Jobson, the cottage had long been a private bolt hole for the couple, a place where Elizabeth, Philip, and their 4 children had gone to relax for more than 50 years. And when the Queen stayed there, something remarkable happened. She cooked. She washed the dishes. Stop and picture that for a moment. At Buckingham Palace, the most famous woman on the planet was attended by dozens of staff who anticipated her every need before she could voice it. At Wood Farm, that same woman stood at a sink, washing up after a meal she had made herself. That contrast tells you everything. Wood Farm wasn't where a marriage went to die. It was the one place on earth where the Queen of the United Kingdom and her husband of 7 decades could be. Simply, 2 old people who loved each other, stripped of crowns and courtiers, sharing a quiet domestic life that the rest of their existence made impossible. The cottage held that meaning for the family long before Philip retired to it. They had been using Wood Farm since 1967, with Philip himself having chosen it as a low-key retreat away from the expense and formality of the main house. Charles hosted shooting parties there in his younger years. Diana stayed there before her engagement. A young Catherine Middleton visited early in her relationship with William. The place was woven through the family's private history. It even carried an older, sadder thread. Back in 1917, King George V and Queen Mary had sent their youngest son, Prince John, to live at Wood Farm because of his worsening epilepsy, and the boy died there in 1919 at just 13. The cottage had seen the full sweep of royal life, its grief and its grace. So when Philip chose it for his retirement, he wasn't picking a random house. He was returning to a place he had loved and shaped for half a century. It was familiar, it was comfortable, and crucially it was finally entirely his. For about 3 years, that was the shape of his life. Quiet days at the cottage, regular visits from the Queen, the long marriage carrying on in a new and gentler form. And then, in early 2020, the world changed, and so did the arrangement. When the pandemic swept across Britain, Philip, by then 98 years old, was firmly in the most vulnerable category imaginable. The decision was made for him to leave Wood Farm and move to Windsor Castle to shield alongside the Queen. And so, for the first time in years, Philip and Elizabeth were living together again, full-time, under one roof. They saw out the lockdown at Windsor with only a tiny core of staff, an arrangement royal watchers came to call HMS Bubble, a nod to the naval life Philip had loved and given up. Just the two of them, sealed off from the world. There is something quietly perfect about how it ended. After all those years of practical, comfortable distance, separate bedrooms, separate residences, a marriage strong enough not to need constant proximity, fate handed them one final, uninterrupted stretch of time together. By many accounts, it was the most concentrated period the two of them had spent alone in decades. Philip's health was failing. His mobility was limited. There had been hospital stays. But he faced those last months at Windsor with the one person who had been beside him since 1947. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, died at Windsor Castle on the 9th of April, 2021, at the age of 99. He did not die at his beloved cottage, but in the place where he and Elizabeth had weathered the pandemic side by side together at the end. It was after his death that the depth of what Wood Farm had meant became impossible to miss. In the months that followed, the grieving Queen returned to the cottage again and again. In her own final years, between Philip's death in 2021 and her own in September 2022, she chose to stay there during the long Sandringham winters, often at his retirement cottage rather than in the comfort of the main house. She was not running from the memories. She was wrapping herself in them. Wood Farm had become sacred ground, the place where her husband had been happiest in his final independent years, and where, for once, they had been allowed to be ordinary together. And Anne, who understood him best, summed up what he left behind with a clarity that only she could manage. Her tribute, after he died, was unsentimental and exactly true to both of them. Her father, she said, had been her teacher, her supporter, and her critic, but above all, it was his example of a life well lived and service freely given that she most wanted to follow. She admitted with characteristic plainness that you know the day is coming, and yet you are never really ready for it. And she noted simply that without him life would be completely different. Notice what is not in any of that. There is no hint of a broken marriage, no suggestion of estrangement or regret. What Anne described was a man of fierce independence and quiet generosity, a father whose example she wanted to live up to, and a partnership between her parents, solid enough to bend without breaking. Because that, in the end, is the real answer to the question the tabloids got so wrong. Philip spent his final years away from the Queen not because their marriage had failed, but because it was strong enough to give each of them what they actually needed. She needed to keep working to be the Queen, present and visible, right up to her final breath. He needed to stop, to rest, to paint, to read, to potter about a cottage by the sea on his own terms, after 70 years of putting duty before himself. A weaker marriage might have demanded that one of them sacrifice their nature for the appearance of togetherness. Theirs was confident enough to do the opposite. It let each of them be fully themselves and trusted that the bond would hold across the distance. And it did, until the very end. There is a lesson buried in all of this, and it's bigger than any one royal cottage. We tend to assume that love means never wanting to be apart, that closeness can be measured in shared square footage, that separate spaces must signal trouble. Philip and Elizabeth spent 73 years proving the opposite. Their marriage suggests that the strongest partnerships are not the ones where two people are inseparable, but the ones where each person can support the other's individual needs without losing the thread that connects them. Love at 90, it turns out, can look very different from love at 30, and adapting to that, rather than fighting it, may be the truest test of a lasting bond. So why did Prince Philip spend his final years away from the Queen? Because he was a man, as his own daughter understood so well, who had earned the right to live exactly as himself, curious, independent, unbothered by ceremony in a place he loved. And because the woman he had married was secure enough in their love to let him have it, while she carried on the work only she could do. They were never really apart in any way that mattered. They simply, finally, gave each other room. 73 years, separate bedrooms, and in the end, separate homes, and still, one of the great love stories the monarchy has ever known. If you believe that real love is about giving someone the freedom to be themselves, leave the word devotion in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more stories that look past the headlines and into the truth of these remarkable lives, subscribe and stay with me. Because the real story is almost always quieter and far more moving than the one the tabloids tried to sell.